What's a podcast?
Daly, what are you going to do next week?
I don't know.
Daly, what's next week?
Fall break.
What is it?
Fall break.
Fall break. When? Wait, is fall break in the fall?
I don't know.
Is fall break in the fall?
I don't know.
What do people do during fall break? Do they go to school?
No.
What do they do?
Stuff.
Stuff? Breaky stuff?
Stuff.
What do people like us do?
Stuff.
Are we going to go camping?
Stuff.
Well, but you're not helpful at all.
Stuff.
All right, that was my stuffy daughter and me unsuccessfully getting her to share about her fall break coming up because it's October. Welcome back, friends, to the ecoChristian podcast. We're exploring what it means to be Christian on planet Earth with me, Caleb Cray Haynes. And y'all, I'm back porching it again because it's the goods, and it is feeling very October-ish. I don't know why, but where I live, when this time of the year comes around, without fail, every year, all of these, I kid you not, all these giant spiders just show up, and I have to walk around my yard with caution because I end up in their net. But also, there's this crow. It's very Edgar Allan Poe out here. There's this crow like circling me. So anyway, love it all. Yes, today I'm very excited to share this conversation with you all with Travis West, and we're talking about his new book called The Sabbath Way. And honestly, I had intended for us to get into a lot of intersections, particularly environmental intersections, but we just went for it, and it just is so good, and I love how it turned out, and so I'm so excited to share this conversation. One other really quick thing I'm going to share is my new book. It is called Earthbound Christian: Flourishing Within Limits in the Age of Infinite Growth, friends. I'm just pumped about this. It's all the things I feel like maybe I'm not supposed to say, and I put it in a book. So here we are. You know, at some point we just have to throw our hands up and say, yep, we're human. Yep, there's problems, and we just have to name them sometimes. But we also have to do the faithful work of naming where to go from here and the kind of posture that is required of us to be a part of the healing between us and God's creation. And it may not be the posture that we think it is. Anyway, spoiler alert. Yes, so I'm excited to share that. That's coming out probably probably early 2026. So I don't quite know yet, so stay tuned. So good, friends. Well, I'm not going to belabor this. Here is our conversation with Travis West, and man, y'all, so good. Digging into the Sabbath Way. Okay, friends, I'm here with Travis West. Travis is professor of Hebrew and Old Testament at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan. His previous books, Biblical Hebrew, An Interactive Approach, and The Art of Biblical Performance, advocate for incorporating performance, embodiment, and play into the process of learning biblical Hebrew and interpreting biblical stories, which is just so cool. We didn't do that when I learned Hebrew, but this is very enticing. When he's away from the classroom and the writing desk, he can be found searching for wonder while walking the fields near his house, going to a farmer's market, watching a movie, or hanging out with his wife, who is his most consistent source of delight and amazement. I love that so much. Welcome, Travis.
Thanks, Caleb. It's a real joy to be here.
Oh man, so much fun. What's it like up in Michigan right now, by the way? Is it still hot?
Right now, it's sunny, but pretty cloudy at the same time, which is always kind of an interesting kind of ambient experience of the cloudy and sunny together. But it's not as warm as it has been. It was in the 80s for basically all of September, but it's starting to get into the 70s, which is
starting to feel a little
nice.
bit of the
we call crispness.
That's right. We have first fall down here, and then second fall, and then like the fake fall. We ease into it. Are you near All Sable and those folks? You ever hang out with them?
No, not really. I'm not exactly sure where they are, but I think they're maybe like an hour or two north.
Gotcha. Yeah. I just lump everyone into the oven mitt.
Exactly.
Michigan. I'm like, they're all up there together. So Travis and I first met as co-participant partners in a pilot program with folks with the Evangelical Environmental Network. We were trying to remember some years ago, but that I just remember that I feel like that was one of the first times I met more of quote unquote my people. I was like, oh, there's more people here having these conversations and doing this work. And
I had a similar experience there of like, wow, okay, not only are there a lot of people who are thinking about this, but who have been thinking about it for way longer than I have, and in much greater depth and nuance and complexity. And it was, for me, it was just a great experience of learning and exposure. I don't feel like I necessarily contributed very much to it, but it was a really great learning experience, and met some new friends, which was a joy. And Kyle Myers-Scott, who facilitated that, has been a friend of mine for a long time. So it was really great to see him kind of in his element
That's right.
for a bit. So
yeah. Kyle's great. Yeah. So your work, is centered around Hebrew and biblical studies, which is so cool. But you always seem to be circling your wagons around the environmental side of things. And so, I'd love to hear more of that overlap for you, your own kind of eco-Christian story, but also how these areas kind of come together for you.
Yeah, I grew up in kind of a rural suburban area in just outside of Lansing, Michigan. And we had a neighborhood probably had been built in the 50s, I would guess. But it wasn't the kind of crisscrossing, grid-like suburban place. The streets curved, and there were streams, and the houses were pretty spread apart. And across the main road was this huge field. And there was just like lots of agricultural stuff around me. And I can just remember spending a lot of time as a kid with my brother and sister. And there was a couple of other kids in the neighborhood, but not many. We would just run around on our bikes or our skateboards or whatever, and just run down to the creek, which was a couple blocks away, searching for crayfish and, getting bit by the little pincers. And it was just joyful and free, but it was the created world that held our joy and our freedom. And I very much connected, for most of my life, I've connected that sense of freedom, that sense of joy, that sense of like just levity in my soul. I've connected that with being connected to creation, being in the midst of creation. And so I've always been a lover of the natural world, and have always been someone who felt more peaceful and more myself when I was outside of the buildings and outside of the sirens and the horns and the exhaust and all that, and had a vista to look at, and was moving my body and all that. But that was never kind of explicitly or intentionally reinforced by the worshiping communities I was a part of as a kid. They weren't like opposed to the created world, but they didn't connect my faith and my discipleship to being present to, in love with, and caring for the created world. That just wasn't kind of on my pastors and those leaders' minds. In the communities I grew up in, it was much more of believing the right things, articulating the faith in a compelling way, and having more of the like kind of doctrinal boxes checked than it was. There just wasn't a space for creation in it. And so when I got to college, and particularly when I entered seminary, I had professors who helped make those connections for me. And almost all of those connections were made by my Old Testament professors.
Wow.
Because you can't read 2 pages of the Old Testament and not sort of hear something happening by the oaks of Mamre, right? Or by this tree or that geographic location, or thinking about the promised land, or wandering through the wilderness and there's no water or there's no food, or I mean, just like everything. There's rivers, there's trees, everything takes place in relation to the created world. And it's not just the landscape or the Bible, it's in a sense, it's the Bible's most important character. And so my Old Testament professors helped me see the centrality of the land in the biblical story, but they also helped me connect a theology of creation as central to what it means to be a Christian. To one of my mentor and the person who was the most impactful in my life was a man named Tom Bogart. Is a man named Tom Bogart. He's no longer teaching here at the seminary. He's retired, but he wrote a piece. He never published it, unfortunately, I don't think, but it was called "Caring for the Creation That Cares for Us." And that sense of reciprocity that is so important in Robin Wall Kimmerer's work. If imagine you're familiar with her work.
Yeah.
Indigenous botanist and poet from Braiding Sweetgrass. But that sense of the reciprocity that we first need to recognize that the earth cares for us. We are moment by moment dependent on the earth's provision, not just the oxygen that we breathe, the water that we drink, the food that we eat, right? It's all of those things. And those are just the necessities. It also provides beauty and awe, and it reveals to us God's character and God's presence. God reveals God's self to us. The sacramental elements in worship are very intentionally not random, but mundane, everyday elements, right? Bread and wine and, tap water, right?
Yeah.
It's not holy water, and that's really important. It's like everyday water. It's everyday bread. It's these mundane, ordinary elements that then, as a model for the larger creation, reveal God's presence and God's grace to us, and teach us that actually all of creation reveals God's presence and God's wonder and God's character to us, and therefore we have to treat it appropriately.
So good. There's so much there, and I just love sitting here listening to you unpack that, because I'm getting fired up, and I love that. That's so good. So you've written this beautiful book on the Sabbath and the Sabbath Way, and really there's so much here, and there's no way we'll get to everything, but this is one of the things in talking with you, I want to make sure that readers are sort of catching, and I think that Sabbath is one of those things for some reason maybe hasn't been taught super well in some Christian circles, and and I think that there's some mixed media of theology around the Sabbath and what quote unquote Sabbathing is, or we're called to, but I also think the practice of Sabbath really kind of pushes up against our cultural ideologies pretty hard today, thus also making it even more kind of tricky to dialogue about, or at least has some serious challenges. Anyway, would you share a bit about your personal journey into practicing Sabbath and the joy and friction of that? And, what kind of led you to, I'm going to write a book about Sabbath,
Yeah. Well, my first true relationship let me back up. When my mom was a kid, she experienced a very kind of stereotypical Sabbath of Christendom under the blue laws. If you're familiar with the blue laws, which is like businesses can't be open on Sunday, you can't sell alcohol on Sunday, so it's sort of like civic ordinances that preserve, or their intention was to preserve, a sense of Sabbath keeping across the whole community. And so it was kind of like government imposed Sabbath. But they're very connected to kind of very rigid and legalistic understandings of the Sabbath. And my mom grew up in a community, and particularly in a family that took Sabbath very seriously. And Sabbath was really, the emphasis fell on the holiness of the day and the holiness of God. So that meant that it was an austere day. There was no fun to be had. You could not, my mom during the summers grew up on a lake. She could not go in the water. She could not swim. She could not boat.
Wow.
She couldn't play with her friends. She couldn't run around outside. She could go to church. She could do her Sunday school homework, and she could take a nap, and then she could eat. That was what she was allowed to do.
Wow.
And so she would tell stories about her childhood to me when I was a kid. And I was so grateful that we did not have a Sabbath practice as a family, because that just sounded absolutely miserable, right?
Right.
And so I think maybe in part a reaction against that. And also my dad grew up in a very different kind of home where Sabbath was not practiced. And so I think his perspective kind of won out in our home as a kid. And I call that approach to Sabbath the tentacles of Puritanism. That sort of Puritan rigidity and legalism is still clinging to a lot of people's Sabbath imagination today. And I think a lot of people, you talk about the resistance that people have to Sabbath. I think a lot of people resist it because precisely that's their imagination of Sabbath. Like, it's an austere day that's boring, where you can't do anything. It's all about the prohibitions. It's not about the prohibitions making space for something deeply important and central and meaningful that we are usually too busy or too distracted to make room in our lives for. That's part of my vision of the Sabbath, is that we do have to say no to some things. I mean, Sabbath means cease. So it's about not working, but that Sabbath no is not the ultimate thing. It's the thing before the ultimate thing. It's the thing that enables the ultimate thing. And the ultimate thing is the Sabbath yes, which is the Sabbath makes room for us to experience delight and joy and connection and rest and trust and life. I mean, Sabbath is ultimately about life. It's about returning to our truest selves and reconnecting to the things that make us feel most alive in the world. And that's one of the ways that I think about delight. Yeah, in the book, one of my primary purposes in the book is to reconnect the Sabbath conversation to delight. That the prophet Isaiah says to call the Sabbath a delight. And I think that delight was never in the conversation with Sabbath when I was a kid. But I think delight is something that we don't often give ourselves permission to experience because it's frivolous, or maybe it's a luxury, or we don't have time for that, or we're too busy, or we're too serious, or we're too divided, or we're too angry, or we're too distracted, or too whatever. That delight is that sense of being fully alive in a moment. But that took my wife and I quite a while to get to that point and get to that understanding. So our Sabbath experience started in 2006 when I was a seminary student, and my wife and I traveled to Jerusalem for the summer for me to study biblical Hebrew as kind of the early steps, vocational steps of becoming a professor of Old Testament. And I went there to study the language, but what I didn't expect, and what was the most impactful thing there was encountering a place where Sabbath is still more or less practiced. And the buses shut down, the Jewish shops closed. No one was on the streets. There was nothing to do except for participate.
Yeah.
Follow their lead.
Yeah.
And so my wife and I were like, well, we should just do likewise. When in Rome, when in Jerusalem. And so we integrated that rhythm into our time there that summer. And it was incredibly life-giving and beautiful, and exactly what we had been needing. However, when we came back to Michigan and the buses didn't stop running and the shops weren't closed, and I was still getting homework, and I still had to work all day on Sunday, and I was working in a church at the time, and it was like we just instantly went back to all of the rhythms and all of the inertia of the culture around us that was moving in the direction of faster, more, bigger, and try to fit more into less time, efficiency, busyness, productivity, all of that. And we never practiced Sabbath once after we got back. And so you're asking about kind of the cultural challenges. Like, our culture is not designed with Sabbath in mind. In fact, I would suggest that our culture is designed explicitly to prevent Sabbath. That Sabbath actually poses a threat to a lot of the values in our culture. And so in that sense, it can feel like, and in many ways, it is an act of protest against kind of being defined by what you do, against your life being meaningful because you're busy, against a sense of feeling important because you found your limits and then you've exceeded them, right?
Mm-hmm.
These are some of the values that drive this insatiable sense of productivity and drivenness and striving in our culture. And the Sabbath wants to just ask, what is this all producing?
Mm-hmm.
Walter Brueggemann has a prayer of confession that I really love, and there's a line in it that says something like, help us see what we're doing and who we're becoming while we do it. And I think that's in some ways what the Sabbath allows us to do. It gives us, we pause long enough to see what we're doing, how we're living our lives, and it helps us listen for, discern, and come to a deeper understanding of how the way that we're living our lives is actually shaping our identity, shaping who we are, and maybe shaping us into people that we don't want to be. And the Sabbath gives us the space to reflect on that and to discern, and then to pivot and perhaps change how we're living, and in the hopes of changing who we're becoming while we're living. So I'm jumping around here a little bit, but so we came back in 2006, this 2006-2007 school year, and never Sabbath again. And then I was able to go back to Jerusalem in summer of 2007. Well, we both did, for another Hebrew class. And that was actually where Sabbath clicked for us. And we're like, oh my gosh, this is what we were missing all of this past year. We were just running without stopping, and so exhausted and burnt out. And um, that's where it clicked. And we decided that second summer, okay, we have to bring this back home with us, and we have to find ways of reorganizing our lives around this commitment, because the rhythm of this commitment is not optional. It's necessary for our flourishing. And so we did that, but we didn't have any models. We didn't know what we were doing. We just made it up as we went along, and we mostly failed those first many years. We had more fights on Sabbath than any other day of the week for probably the first 10 years of our Sabbath practice. And mostly that's because we fell into this very quickly. Because we didn't know what we were doing, we fell very quickly into this rhythm of, rush, collapse, rush, collapse. And the collapse was our Sabbath day, where we were, particularly I was running like a chicken with my head cut off all week. And then on the Sabbath day, I just collapsed, and I would often sleep. I didn't want to do anything. I just wanted to sit on my butt because I was just trying to hold the whole world and on my shoulders 6 days of the week. And eventually, after many years, we kind of realized that what we had fallen into was a rhythm of Sabbath that Eugene Peterson called a bastard Sabbath. And that's the Sabbath that's just a pit stop along the week, where your life is ultimately governed by your work, and your Sabbath is enslaved to your work. And so it's enabling you to work at a pace that's unsustainable. And so it's like you run for 6 days on the treadmill, you leap off of it, you get a shot in the arm of more energy, and then you jump back on the treadmill for 6 days. And that's the bastard Sabbath. And that in that sense, it's not a Sabbath. Sabbath in Scripture, particularly in Genesis 1, Sabbath is the climax of the creation story. It's the climax of time, the climax of the week. It's what the whole week leads up to. It's not the collapse that you fall into. So the invitation is to approach your work and your life the other 6 days that allows you to kind of experience Sabbath as the pinnacle of the week, as opposed to the day where you zonk out so that you can keep being an enslaved, slave to your job, and your kid's schedule or whatever the rest of the week holds for you. And so once we kind of realized that, then we were confronted by some really hard decisions that we had to make. Because a lot of that striving and running throughout the week was informed in my own heart and soul by a deep, what do I want to say? A deep commitment to scarcity. That I did not believe there was enough time, and I did not believe there was enough money for me to slow down. And if I slowed down, we would not be able to afford our home or whatever. So my wife has suffered from a debilitating chronic illness for the last 22 years, our whole marriage, and has mostly not been able to work. And so I interpreted our life situation as, okay, it is dependent on me. And that identity that I created around that conviction kind of compelled me to live in a way that was just deeply rooted in scarcity. There was never enough time. There was never enough money. I could never make enough. I could never do enough. I could never take on enough work to pay for all of the needs of our life, her medical bills, and all the other things that we wanted to do. And so that sense of scarcity just drove my engine. And so eventually our Sabbath practice invited me and her to sit down and have a lot of heart-to-heart talks about what identity have we constructed around our life, and how is that identity compelling us to live in ways that are really unhealthy, and to make decisions in our lives that are that we are making out of scarcity, as opposed to making decisions out of a trust in the abundance of God.
Yeah.
And so that completely transformed our life, really. And another part of our story is that her long illness. I talk about this in the opening chapter of the book. How her illness kind of ushered us into. I don't want to talk about it as if it's her illness, as if she possesses it. It's somehow a part of her identity, but like her health challenges. As we tried to meet those challenges, we just found ourselves being exiled further and further from delight. And that the life just felt more serious, more heavy, more difficult, more onerous, more scary, and mysterious and uncertain. And delight, which for the two of us had been very easy to come by up until our honeymoon, really, when we discovered the beginnings of this chronic illness. Delight just became more and more difficult to find. And it was our Sabbath practice that began the process of reconnecting us to delight and giving us space. Sabbath doesn't like solve your life's problems for you, of course, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't like heal your wife's body. It doesn't double the size of your paycheck. What it does is it gives you the space to process your life in healthy and unhurried ways. And that's one of the things that it can do. And that's what it has done for us. And that has changed our relationship with delight, but also with suffering. That delight and suffering are actually, you flex the same soul muscles when you experience suffering and you experience delight. And the soul muscles are the ability to be present. What we discovered is that because we were so resistant to entering in and fully experiencing the suffering and the difficulty and disappointment, and even the resentment that came out of her experience of chronic illness, we were also cutting ourselves off from experiencing joy and delight and joy and gratitude and the good things of life, because we were numbing ourselves or escaping from that experience of pain, that we were no longer able to be present to anything in our life. And so we had to lean in and trust to be more present to the pain and the difficulty. And in doing so, we actually began loosening those muscles, and we were counterintuitively also able to be more present to the delight and the joy in our life as well. And that was a really unexpected discovery, but it was the Sabbath invitation to delight that led us down that path. And it transformed our relationship with her illness, and has opened us to deeper experiences of delight and joy than we certainly had access to before that.
Yeah. Wow, man, there's so much there, and
I just talked
deeply,
for
no,
15 minutes or something there.
no, it was like literally fantastic. And I'm just so thankful that you shared that story and this, the struggle and the reality of all of that. And you named so many things there really well, and especially thinking about the inertia of our culture that keeps us moving, and of course that leads us to, further avoid being present and confronting the realities, right? Because we think we can just escape, that we can just run around the edges of the pool forever without ever falling in. And yeah, there's so much there. I really appreciate that. And yeah, and I think there is a temptation there too with Sabbath and thinking about Sabbath, right, as just like another product. We pop our Sabbath pill on the weekends, or and so underneath this, right, is wrestling with gosh, what is Sabbath like? What and what am I, quote unquote, supposed to get out of it? How am I supposed to enter into this posture? And so many questions do surface there. You in, I feel like, I don't remember, maybe chapter 2 or something, you write extensively kind of about work, and particularly disembodied work. And you write, quote, "If we are what we do, and what we do has no obvious or inherent life affirming purpose beyond securing us a paycheck, we hemorrhage a significant resource of meaning in our lives, draining work of its power to connect us with each other and to something larger than ourselves," unquote. And I wonder if you'd unpack that a little bit more, and why is work part of what we've got to talk about here? I mean, there's some obvious things, but and I'm also curious too, thinking about like, what kind of work do we avoid if we're trying to Sabbath, and just that kind of conversation there.
Yeah, it's a big question. So the fourth commandment, which is the Sabbath commandment, actually commands two things. It doesn't just command rest. 6 days you shall work, and the seventh is a Sabbath to the Lord. And so work, you can't talk about Sabbath without talking about work. And I would say you can't talk about work without talking about Sabbath, but unfortunately in our day and age, you can definitely talk about work without talking about Sabbath, but we ought not be able to talk about work without talking about Sabbath. Biblically speaking, you can't talk about dignified work without talking about Sabbath. So I think it's either in that chapter or the next chapter where I compare there's two main types of work in the Bible, but particularly in the book of Exodus. And the first half of the book of Exodus is work in Egypt for Pharaoh. This is a kind of ancient analog to our current industrialized economy, driven by scarcity and incessant, unending productivity. And then there's work in the wilderness for the Lord, building the tabernacle, which is work that is dignified and work that participates in God's creative activity in Genesis 1. And the difference between those two types of work is Sabbath. In Egypt, under Pharaoh's thumb, there is no Sabbath. But in the wilderness, in partnership with God, the giver and creator of Sabbath, work always gives way to Sabbath every week. So to speak about work in the biblical imagination is necessarily to talk about Sabbath. But again, that's not the case. That's not the case today. I'm trying to change that a little bit with this book. So that quote that you read is coming from a section where I'm talking about some of the culture, the current culture of work that makes Sabbath so challenging and difficult. And I kind of lean on a book that Miroslav Volf wrote many years ago, where he kind of traces the history of work through different phases of human history. And during the initial phase of human history, which was like 95% of human history, was what he called the agricultural phase, where work was embedded in local communities. It was physical. It was guided by the sun. And there was a direct connection between the labor that someone did and the life that someone sustained together in community. And so the work was not easy necessarily, and maybe not even enjoyable, but it was meaningful because it contributed directly and explicitly to the survival of the community and the neighborhood. And then the second phase of work was industrial or automated work, where the Industrial Revolution comes in and you start creating these remarkable efficiencies where productivity skyrockets. And you think of like the assembly line kind of model of work, where the dignified nature of work reduces, but the productivity that is created through work increases dramatically. And so work can take on work. It's deeply associated with time here. Time becomes money in this sense. And so the hourly wage, that kind of thing, is created during this time. And then the third phase is the digitization of the Industrial Revolution, where the same basic principles get applied, but in a global context and in a digital context. And so I sort of zoom out and look at this history, and what I see when I look at it is an increasingly what I call the abstractification of work, where work becomes more and more mental, cognitive activity, and it's further and further and further removed from the ground itself. You know, people are doing work on the 100th floor of a high-rise building, right? They can't even see the ground. Or they're doing it deep in a basement, illuminated by fluorescent light, where they can't see the ground either. But also the work itself has no intrinsic meaning. You can't, it's not obvious how you can connect, like creating the code for some kind of app that is going to keep data for some global multinational corporation, keep track of sales or whatever. It's not obvious how that person can connect. The work that I'm doing is contributing to the life of my neighborhood or my community in XYZ ways.
Right.
And so the only meaning that they derive from their work is either the interactions they have with their coworkers or the check that they get every week or every other week in their checking account. And so the lack of these meaningful contexts in which our work is done, I think it increases dissatisfaction in work, depression, anxiety, loneliness, isolation, a sense of kind of existential dread of what is my life even worth? What am I doing with my life? How am I contributing to society? All of these kinds of questions that I think are proliferating in our world right now are the inevitable outcome of the ongoing abstractification of work.
Yeah.
And so, but another thing that does is the work is mostly cognitive and it's mostly mediated by screens. And so one of the things that the Sabbath can do is, one, it can give us space to reconnect with those meaningful contexts that give our life meaning, the people and the places that we feel more ourselves and help make our lives worth living. But also it gives us space to actually reconnect with our whole bodies. If 40 hours a week we're basically a brain with fingertips typing on screens or tapping screens,
Yeah.
We can easily just forget that we have bodies. And so we can, we sit for 8 hours a day, and then we have, heart issues or blood issues or circulation issues and depression and et cetera, et cetera. And so it can help us actually reconnect with, remember that we have bodies, and it can help us reconnect with the earth and reconnect with people and be remembered back to ourselves. And also it might give people an opportunity to ask, what do I want to do with my life? And maybe they can't change jobs, but maybe there are small ways that they could use Sabbath, the space that a Sabbath affords, to kind of dip their toe into a different way of contributing, a different way of belonging to the world. Um, I don't know what that might be, a volunteer kind of thing, or visiting all of the parks in your county, or I don't know quite what that might look like, but people can be creative, and if they're feeling like they're missing something in life, maybe Sabbath can be an opportunity to start experimenting with how to get reconnected to whatever it feels like you're missing.
Yes, yes. Oh man. Yeah, I think hitting on I love the brains with fingertips because I feel like that's so much that's so much there, and it does, and I do. My wife and I, we've practiced. We started practicing Sabbath together in college, actually, when we were dating. Wow. And it became one of those things. And my wife Emily, she's like great at like, she's like, this is clearly something we're supposed to do, so let's do it. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, I guess I've never really thought about it in the ways you're describing it. And we ended up, similar story, but we ended up Sabbathing together on Saturdays and having those practices. And and I lived in Germany for a while, which is kind of similar to what you're describing. It's like on Sundays, particularly, everything's closed. So if you hadn't bought your groceries, too bad. And that sort of thing. And that obviously helped with that. But one of the practices is like, just turning your phone off on this one day and that sort of thing, and the screens and the socials and I wonder. So, what does it look like to? I find this is a little bit of a kind of getting into the nitty gritty of well, what are okay? We're acknowledging that Sabbath is not just some list of do's and don'ts, and I think you write like thou shalt nots and all the things that we think of maybe that turn us off, quote unquote, when we think about practicing Sabbath. But at the same time, what are the healthy or the do's and don'ts that offer the boundaries of joy and the boundaries to delight and that sort of thing. I wonder if you'd maybe share a little bit about how you guys approach that, or just some brief thoughts on that. Or
I'd love to. An image that has been really helpful for me comes from the creation story. On the second day of creation, God separates the waters above from the waters below, and does that by breathing into the waters and creating what in Hebrew is called a rakia. And the rakia is basically, it's translated as the firmament or the dome or something like that. But what it is it's a boundary that creates the conditions in which life can flourish. That's fundamentally what a rakia is. Specifically, it creates oxygen for organic life to emerge and live, which would be impossible in the midst of the chaotic waters, of course. But it's a boundary that creates the conditions for life to flourish. And I think if the rakia is the boundary in the waters, Sabbath is a rakia in time. And what we do on Sabbath is we establish a boundary in the noise and the chaos and the busyness and the distraction of our life that creates the conditions for joy to flourish, for delight to flourish, for gratitude to flourish in our home. And so one of the ways that we establish that boundary is we have made what I call threshold rituals. This is something that it took us a long time to learn. We, for years and years and years, did not have any formal start or end to our Sabbath. And so we never were really sure, like, okay, is it still work time or are we in rest time now? And eventually, this just a few years ago, probably 5 or 6 years ago, we decided that we had to have a formal time for our Sabbath to begin and end. And the way that we did that was by doing something like this is sort of drew from the Jewish practice of like lighting candles. We had brought a Sabbath plate home with us from Jerusalem that has Shabbat in Hebrew written on it. And so we sort of keep all that in storage during the week. And we bring all that out on Friday night. We do Friday night to Saturday night because when we started Sabbath, I was working at a church, 12 hours a day on Sundays. And so that was out for Sabbath. And so Friday night, we bring that out, we set it up, we sing a little song, we say some blessings, and that sort of marks the beginning of our Sabbath. And we do two other really important things that help create the conditions for life to flourish. One of them you mentioned, we turn our phones off. We stick them down in the laundry room in the basement. But first, we thank them. We acknowledge the gift that they are to us. We thank them for connecting us to friends, for showing us, funny memes and all sort of things, the joy that we get, because they are remarkable machines.
Yeah.
And so we acknowledge the gifts they are, and then we put them away. And then so that's the first thing we do. The second thing that we do that creates the conditions for life to flourish is that we cover the clocks in our house. And so we basically we try to create a timeless day. We try to prevent ourselves from knowing what time it is. And what it does is it actually helps us notice how often we check to see what time it is. And how controlled we are by what time it is and by clock time. And so that helps to create the context in which we're just present to the moment. We don't know what time it is, so it's just now o'clock. And when we don't know what time it is, we start paying more attention to our bodies. We eat when we're hungry. We go for a walk when we're restless. We go to sleep and take a nap if we're tired. And so those three things, having a threshold ritual, putting away our phones, and limiting distractions, and covering the clocks in our house, are those initial that sets the boundary, or that creates the rakia. And then we fill that time with the things that we love to do most. We eat together. We always get outside. We play together. We read. We spend a lot of time journaling together because my wife is a professional journaler, and she has convinced me over the years of the power of self-reflection. And one of the gifts and the opportunities of Sabbath is to step out of our lives and get perspective on our life. Like I said near the beginning, like, how are we living, and who are we becoming as we live in that way? And so we ask ourselves intentional questions, and we journal on those, and then we share what we discovered with each other. And those, every week, that leads to like really deep and important discoveries, and we get to know each other and ourselves more. And those often will translate into other conversations we have during the week about, well, remember what we were talking about on Sabbath, and how we were getting frustrated with or feeling resentful about X, Y, or Z in our life. How can we actually show up to our life differently to try to mitigate that resentment, or own our own responsibility in that situation more, or something like that. So that journaling has become more and more, even just in the last year or two, more and more important for our Sabbath practice. And then we also realize that not everybody experiences delight and rest in the same way. That something that you find restful, I might find it resonates with work for me, might find stressful. And something that I find delightful, you might feel is really boring. And so we have a few hours every Saturday where we just do our own thing. And so she might do more journaling because she doesn't get enough with the amount of time that I can do it. She might take a nap. I'll usually watch a movie because that's one of my favorite things to do. And so yeah, those are some of the practical things that fill our Sabbath.
Yeah, it's really helpful to hear just some of the nuts and bolts around that practice, and obviously that's going to change depending on who you are, where you are,
It's going
and all
to be
that.
totally different for each person. And in the book, I try not to be prescriptive about that, about
Sure.
what people actually fill their Sabbath with. The point is to learn about the values of Sabbath and to think about, okay, how do you frame a Sabbath? But
Right.
it's got to be specific to each family.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm sure even with you guys, there's a tension around like the perfectionism of it. You're not, it's like you don't want to become the quote unquote the Pharisee around it. All of a sudden, and so but you can see how how that could happen over time. But yeah, that's just really good, and there's so many things here that so like would be another podcast if we went down the rabbit hole, but you have some really great things to say around, you kind of talk about that, the whole section around trained in greed, and you kind of get into Wendigo economics there at the end, which if anyone has, if our listeners have read any Robin Wall Kimmerer's work writing about some of those kind of Wendigo economics and that sort of indigenous posture and conversation around sanctioned greed and taking, and there's so many threads here that I think are really helpful there around understanding Sabbath, and one of the things that I feel like I'm returning to over and over again, and you even mentioned in the book around this and belonging and exile and some of the things you've already mentioned, is this need to sort of return to our indigenous relations with the natural world is tied in here as well. Anyway, is there anything brief there that you'd want to add on to that or mention or extract?
Yeah, I mean, Robin Wall Kimmerer has been deeply impactful to me, and she appears in the book in several places. One, in that chapter you're referring to, with this sense of Wendigo economics. And almost the whole last chapter is in some ways dedicated to her. And particularly her chapter in Braiding Sweetgrass called Allegiance to Gratitude. Was really, really impactful for me. And so that last chapter is called Prerequisites for a Life of Gratitude. And she becomes a professor in teaching a class in this made-up curriculum of what does it look like, and what are the skills and capacities that we need, the character traits that we need to live a life steeped in gratitude. And that, drawing out of her chapter on allegiance to gratitude, is really something that I am learning from indigenous authors of that, like her and Randy Woodley, who's also been a really impactful author and friend in my own life, and thankfully, and I'm so grateful he was one of the endorsers of the book. His book Shalom in the Community of Creation. It's been really impactful to me. And this posture that indigenous communities have, not only towards the created world, but towards life, as a posture of gratitude, understanding and embracing the abundance of the created world, that the world itself is fundamentally abundant. And we in the West, informed by the kind of colonial mentality of Europe and of empire, we counterintuitively have adopted a posture of scarcity, and that scarcity drives us. And that sense of scarcity is what drives the Wendigo, which is this indigenous monster of folklore, indigenous folklore that is eats and eats and eats and is never satiated. It just consumes and consumes, but the more it consumes, the less it has, or the more hungry it becomes. And that really is a really powerful and painful metaphor for our economy. And one of the antidotes to the Wendigo approach to the economy and to life is a sense of sufficiency and contentment and gratitude. Gratitude is what we offer the world when we feel like we have enough, and the world gives us enough and models that generosity that gratitude is built on. So in all of those ways, I've been deeply influenced by Robin Wall Kimmerer and other Indigenous authors, and I just think that we by we I mean largely white people in the West, we have so much to learn, and that posture of humility and teachability, I think, is really important. An important posture to take in life in general, but particularly towards those who have stewarded this land that we are living on for thousands of years.
Yeah. I was so excited to see some of those that being sort of woven into this book here on Sabbath, because those are just some really wonderful connections, and that I hope that is intriguing our listeners to get their hands on a copy of this book. So thank you for sharing all that. And you just have so many good things to say, and I want to say you have a lot of really fun words in your book as well, and you talk about thingification and familiarability. That's it. Yeah.
I had to practice that one several times before I recorded the audiobook.
Oh yeah. That's gonna get you. That one's gonna get you. Yeah. There's so much there, but I wonder if there are any last words you wanted to leave listeners with, or a word of encouragement, or just anything like that.
Sure. Actually, if you wouldn't mind, I could just read the last paragraph of the book, which I think articulated what I want to leave a reader with, or what I want to leave a listener with. As you begin to walk this ancient path, remember that the Sabbath is no petty overlord demanding perfection and punishing you for every infraction. It is a wellspring of grace and life and love, bubbling up to overflowing with playfulness and delight. It wants nothing more than for you to live your life to the full. Trust in the goodness of the Sabbath. Fall into its open arms. Experiment. Play. Be creative. Adapt. Try something. Then try something else. Take it seriously, but not too seriously. A Sabbath practice boils down to this: make room and show up. If you do that week after week, there is no telling what may happen, who you'll become, and what delights you'll experience along the Sabbath way.
Friends, there's nothing else to be said there. I hope that you'll continue to follow the show, to leave us a rating. You can find this show and find other things I'm cooking up on Substack. All this is in the show notes. Travis's book is in the show notes. Yes, friends, I hope that you also can find yourself experiencing somewhat of a fall break, y'all. All right, God bless.